The air is thick with smoke and horse sweat. You stand in a vast tent lit by flickering candles, their shadows crawling across the silk walls like restless spirits. The smell of blood still lingers from the battlefield outside, but here, inside, the atmosphere is different, heavier, suffocating. Chains rattle softly in the darkness, though you see no prisoners. Instead, the sound comes from women draped in silk, their eyes lowered, their bodies trembling as they wait. You hear the slow crunch of boots against the rug, each step deliberate, claiming the silence. This is no place of intimacy, but of power, a theatre where desire is twisted into conquest. And somewhere beyond the curtain, the most feared man in history prepares to make his entrance. Genghis Khan, not just a warlord, but a ruler who conquered bodies as ruthlessly as he conquered empires. Before the world knew him as Genghis Khan, he was Temujin, a boy shaped by loss, betrayal, and hunger. But even in these early years, before his armies thundered across Asia, he learned that power was never just about the sword. It was also about possession, of people, of loyalty, of bodies. You can almost picture the scene, the winds of the Mongolian steppe howling across endless grasslands, the smoke of a small fire rising from a scattered camp. Among nomads, marriage was a bond of survival, alliances stitched together with the promise of wives, daughters, and sisters. Women were not individuals but threads in a larger fabric of tribal politics. Their worth was measured in cattle, horses, and the strength they could bring to a clan's future. Temujin witnessed this brutal arithmetic as a child. His own mother had been stolen from another tribe, a captive bride who endured her fate in silence. To him, this was not strange but normal, the way the world worked, the way men claimed dominance. And as he grew, this lesson hardened into belief. Intimacy was not born of love, but of conquest. Later, when Temujin forged his rise, these early scars resurfaced in every aspect of his rule. To outsiders, he was the Khan who brought order and loyalty through iron discipline. To his own people, he became a leader who demanded unwavering submission. But beneath the surface, there was another realm, one hidden from the battlefield. Behind the facade of the warrior lay a mask of power that extended into the most private corners of life. Here, in the shadows of his tent, the same rules applied as on the battlefield: surrender or be destroyed. Women were symbols of victory, tokens of allegiance, and vessels of legacy. And in his hands, their fates were written not by choice, but by command. As Temujin rose from outcast to warlord, his path was paved with both loyalty and fear. Every alliance he forged was sealed not just with oaths of brotherhood, but with women offered as tokens of trust. Each bride became a political currency, binding clans to his growing power. The clinking of horse harnesses, the smell of roasted mutton, the chanting of shamans around the fire. All of it framed a society where women were never truly their own. One story from his early rise stands out. His beloved Börte, the wife he chose in his youth. She was more than a companion. She was a symbol of his claim to legitimacy. But even Börte's fate revealed the fragility of intimacy under Mongol law. When she was kidnapped by a rival tribe, Temujin waged war not only for love, but to reclaim what he saw as his rightful possession. Her abduction was an insult, but her return, after months in captivity, became a public statement. No man could touch what belonged to him without consequence. Yet behind the public victory lingered a silence. What did Börte endure in those months? How did she feel returning to a husband who saw her body as a matter of pride, of politics, of vengeance? History does not record her voice. For Genghis Khan, these personal battles blurred with the larger wars he fought. The same principles that applied to land and armies applied to women: conquer, hold, and never let go. His tent became an extension of the battlefield, a space where women bore the invisible wounds of conquest. Silk curtains rustled like banners, and the flicker of candlelight masked a deeper truth: that in the shadows of power, intimacy was always chained to domination. By the time Temujin declared himself Genghis Khan, universal ruler, his philosophy of power was complete. Every battle won was mirrored by victories in the private sphere. The same rules that bent warriors to his will now governed the bodies of women who lived under his shadow. In the Mongol world, marriage was no longer about kinship. It was about conquest. Tribes who surrendered their allegiance were compelled to offer daughters as a sign of loyalty. Defeated leaders saw their wives taken as spoils of war, their beauty paraded as proof of submission. What happened on the battlefield echoed in the Khan's tent, where chains were invisible but no less binding. For Genghis, intimacy was never tender. It was strategy. A woman could secure the loyalty of a conquered people, or she could be a living reminder of defeat. In his court, silk and jewels masked the reality of captivity. Candles burned through the night, not for warmth or romance, but as silent witnesses to the bargains struck in flesh. And yet, This was not seen as cruelty by his followers. It was order. The steppe demanded survival, and survival demanded control. To the Khan's men, he embodied the perfect balance of warrior and ruler, a man who bent not only nations, but entire bloodlines to his will. His harem swelled, filled not only with Mongol women, but with captives from China, Persia, and beyond. Each woman was both a conquest and a political tool, bound by rules she could never question. But behind the grandeur, there was a darker truth. For the women themselves, the Khan's legacy was not one of honor or empire. It was one of silence. Their voices do not echo through history. Their eyes do not stare from painted portraits. They existed as shadows behind the mask of power, seen, yet never heard. With the empire rising, Genghis Khan's public legend grew. But within the silk-draped chambers of his private world, a different empire was being forged. One written not in blood on the battlefield, but in the quiet suffering of women whose stories the world would never fully know. Step inside the great Khan's private world, and the air itself changes. The battlefield's roar of hooves and clashing steel fades, replaced by the muted hush of silk curtains swaying in lamplight. The smell of burning incense mixes with the musk of sweat and horse leather, carried in from outside. Here, inside these chambers, power wore a different mask, softer on the surface, but no less suffocating. The harem was not a place of romance, but of rules. Women from across the empire, captives from China, Persia, Khwarezm, and beyond, were gathered like treasures, each one catalogued not by her voice or soul, but by her usefulness. Some were chosen to bear heirs, others to strengthen alliances, and many to serve as living symbols of conquest. Their beauty was their weapon, but also their chain. Days passed in ritual. Before dawn, servants lit candles to chase away the darkness and prepared baths scented with herbs. Women were expected to remain immaculate, their skin polished with oils, their hair combed until it shone under the flicker of firelight. Every gesture, every word spoken, was governed by unspoken codes. Silence was safer than conversation. Stillness was safer than laughter. At night, the waiting began. The sound of boots in the corridor decided a woman's fate for the evening. The chosen one was led behind a curtain, her steps echoing softly on the rugs, while the others sat frozen, knowing that being passed over might mean safety, or it might mean invisibility. In the eyes of the Khan, intimacy was not an act of affection, but an extension of empire. To share his bed was not to be cherished. It was to be claimed, consumed, and branded as part of his legacy. For the women, survival meant blending into the silence of the chamber. Behind jeweled veils and painted lips, they learned to erase their emotions, because in these hidden rooms, the only sound louder than the crackle of fire was the quiet rhythm of lives lived without choice. Life in the Khan's harem was a constant performance, and every woman knew the stakes. The chamber might have shimmered with gold-threaded rugs and carved wooden chests, but beneath the luxury lay an invisible battlefield. Rivals sat side by side, their smiles polite, their eyes sharp. A glance too bold, a word too daring, could mean exile, or worse. Each woman carried two burdens, the weight of her beauty and the fear of losing it. A wrinkle, an illness, or even a rumor could strip her of favor. To fall from the Khan's gaze was to become nothing, left to rot in silence, traded off as a servant, or discarded to a distant outpost. This knowledge made alliances fragile. Women whispered to one another in the quiet hours, but always with caution, unsure if the ears listening belonged to a friend or a spy. Fear was not only of being forgotten, but also of being chosen. At dusk, the flicker of a servant's lantern signaled the Khan's will. The chosen woman walked forward like a soldier summoned to battle. Her body was not her own, but a vessel for empire. For some, this meant the chance to bear a son who could change her fortune. For others, it meant enduring the night with clenched teeth, knowing refusal was impossible. And still, survival demanded silence. Women learned to hide their sorrow behind painted faces, to mask their despair with perfume and silk. Their chambers were filled with laughter during festivals, but behind the curtains, tears fell quietly into embroidered pillows. Even in luxury, they lived like prisoners. Every step watched, every gesture judged, their worth bound to the desires of one man. In this world of hushed footsteps and guarded glances, even a whispered sigh could be dangerous. Survival meant mastering invisibility, yet remaining unforgettable. A paradox that every woman carried within her heart. The harem was not ruled only by the Khan's will. It was bound by rituals and the weight of belief. Each gesture, each night's choice, was cloaked in superstition that gave cruelty the appearance of order. Shamans and priests whispered that the Khan's virility was sacred, a sign that heaven itself favored his reign. To share his bed was to be touched by destiny, they said. But for the women, this blessing felt more like a chain, Before entering his chamber, some were bathed in herbs said to cleanse the spirit. Their skin rubbed with oils meant to make them worthy. Incense burned thick in the air, drowning out the quiet terror in their chests. The scent of juniper and sandalwood clung to their hair long after the ritual ended, a reminder that their bodies no longer belonged to themselves but to a story written by others. Every pregnancy was celebrated as proof of the Khan's divine power. Sons were hailed as future warriors, heirs to a bloodline meant to stretch across continents. Daughters, though cherished less, were still tokens of alliance, promised a way to strengthen the empire's reach. In this way, even the wombs of women became tools of conquest, their bodies folded into the machinery of empire. Religion and ritual offered a cruel illusion that their suffering was noble, their submission sacred. But in the silence between ceremonies, when candles burned low and shadows stretched across the chamber walls, women knew the truth. They were not wives in any tender sense. They were vessels, their lives consumed by the hunger of a man who sought to conquer not only nations, but generations. In the end, superstition was another weapon. Chains of belief bound them more tightly than iron ever could, convincing the world outside that what happened in these chambers was destiny, not domination. And under the dim glow of oil lamps, the women learned that their silence was not only expected, it was demanded by heaven itself. Obedience in Genghis Khan's empire was not simply demanded, it was carved into the soul. For his soldiers, it came through loyalty and fear of betrayal. For the women of his chambers, it was stitched into every breath, every movement, until even their silence became a form of survival. Imagine the stillness of a woman seated on a low cushion, the rug beneath her damp with candle wax. Her hands fold neatly in her lap, though her nails bite into her palms. She has learned not to look too long into the Khan's eyes, nor to turn her head away too quickly. Every gesture is calculated, rehearsed, a mask she wears to keep herself safe. This is what obedience looked like, not chains of iron, but the invisible threads of control woven through the smallest details of daily life. The Khan's power rested not only on physical domination, but on reshaping identity itself. Women stripped of their names, their tribes, even their languages, became shadows of who they once were. A girl from Persia no longer spoke her mother's tongue. A captive from China wore Mongol dress and learned Mongol customs. Their pasts faded, their individuality erased, until they belonged only to him and his empire. And yet, obedience carried its own torment. To obey meant to survive, but it also meant losing fragments of oneself piece by piece. Some women accepted this fate, burying their sorrow deep inside. Others resisted in subtle ways. An unfinished task, a glance of defiance quickly hidden, a whispered lullaby from their homeland, sung under their breath when no one was listening. Small rebellions, perhaps, but they were enough to remind themselves that they had once been free. Still, the price of disobedience was steep. A word too sharp, a refusal too bold, and punishment followed swiftly. The chambers might have been filled with silk and gold, but beneath the luxury, women lived as if walking on glass, their every step echoing with the risk of shattering. The cost of obedience was not always visible. It was not written in bruises or scars, but in the quiet hollowing of the soul. For many women, submission became a second skin, something they wore so tightly that even they began to forget who they had once been. At first, the silence was unbearable. Nights stretched long beneath the flicker of oil lamps, the air heavy with the scent of smoke and sweat. In that silence, fear spoke louder than words. Will I be chosen tonight? Will I be cast aside tomorrow? These questions became prayers, whispered into pillows damp with tears. Over time, however, silence hardened into habit. To survive, women learned to numb themselves, to push their emotions deep beneath layers of obedience, until even sorrow felt muted. But the mind is never so easily conquered. Isolation carved invisible wounds. Many women lived far from their homelands, separated from families they would never see again. Their languages vanished from their lips, their songs forgotten. In their place grew an inner voice of doubt, telling them they were powerless, replaceable, forgotten. This was the truest chain of all. When a captive began to believe she deserved captivity. And yet, human beings find ways to endure. Some clung to small rituals, braiding their hair in the style of their mothers, whispering lullabies from childhood, or tracing patterns on the rugs that reminded them of home. Others placed their hope in their children, pouring all their love into a son who might one day wield power, or a daughter who might escape a similar fate. Still, the weight of obedience lingered like a shadow. Every smile was measured, every word rehearsed, every glance carefully lowered. To outsiders, they looked like jewels draped in silk, honored and exalted. But beneath the surface, they were women fighting invisible wars within their own minds, wars no one would ever record in the chronicles of empire. Even under the crushing weight of obedience, rebellion found small, fragile ways to survive. These acts were rarely open defiance. They were whispers against the storm, sparks hidden beneath ash, but they mattered, for they revealed that submission was never complete. Some women resisted through silence itself, choosing not to flatter, not to beg, not to weep in front of him. Their stillness became a shield, a quiet refusal to give him the satisfaction of seeing their fear. Others held fast to memory, keeping alive fragments of their identity. A Persian lullaby sung to a child, a prayer whispered in Chinese, a secret embroidery stitched into the hem of a robe. These small acts declared, I was someone before this. I am someone still. Occasionally, resistance took bolder forms. Servants carried rumors of women who feigned illness to avoid his summons, who sabotaged rivals with whispered lies, or who refused to bear children by quietly sabotaging pregnancies. Such defiance was perilous. If discovered, punishment was swift and merciless. But even the attempt revealed a stubborn ember of autonomy. For many, rebellion was not about escape, but about endurance. To survive another day was itself resistance, a refusal to let the empire erase them completely. Their resilience was carved into their silence, their ability to endure the endless rituals, the suffocating rules, the ever-present fear. In their quiet defiance, they preserved something the Khan could never fully conquer, the unbroken fragments of self. Yet history records little of these hidden battles. To chroniclers, they were shadows in silk, nameless figures orbiting the great Khan. But within the silence of obedience lay countless stories of courage, small rebellions that, though unseen, whispered through time. History remembers Genghis Khan as a conqueror of nations, yet his greatest conquest may have been hidden within bloodlines. Through countless unions, forced or strategic, he fathered children across the breadth of his empire. Today, genetic studies suggest that millions may carry his blood, a living echo of his reach. But for each lineage traced, there is a silence that cannot be measured. The voices of women whose bodies became vessels of empire, their stories buried beneath his legacy. The tent of the Khan was not merely a private space. It was a factory of dynasties. Sons born within those silk walls grew to command armies, their existence proof of the Khan's divine power. Daughters were traded like tokens, their marriages binding distant rulers into webs of loyalty. In this way, the harem was not separate from politics. It was politics. Intimacy became empire, reproduction became conquest. Yet, what of the women themselves? Their names rarely appear in chronicles. They exist as shadows behind great battles, as footnotes beneath the triumphs of men. Börte, his first and most honored wife, is remembered only for bearing heirs and enduring abduction. The others, hundreds, perhaps thousands, remain faceless, their suffering distilled into statistics, their silence mistaken for consent. This silence is itself a legacy. By erasing the voices of women, history preserved only the narrative of power, never the price. Their obedience became invisible scaffolding, holding up an empire celebrated for its victories but blind to its cruelties. Even today, when we marvel at the sheer scale of Genghis Khan's descendants, we rarely pause to ask, at what cost were they born? Behind every number lies a woman who endured the weight of empire, and though her name may be lost, her silence speaks still, a haunting reminder that conquest is not written only in blood and steel. It is carved into the bodies and memories of those who could not choose. Dynasty was the hidden engine of Genghis Khan's empire. Every campaign, every alliance, every raid was ultimately tied to the question of succession. Who would carry his blood and extend his rule beyond his lifetime? The women in his chambers became the silent architects of this future, though history never gave them credit. Börte, his first wife, secured her place as the mother of his principal heirs. Her sons would inherit the mantle of leadership, and her lineage would dominate Mongol politics for generations. But Börte was not alone. Other wives and concubines bore children who vied for power, their claims sparking rivalries that shaped the course of empires. What appeared as domestic life was in truth a battleground of dynastic intrigue, where every birth carried political consequences. The women themselves maneuvered as best they could within their confined roles. A son could elevate his mother to prominence, granting her influence in courtly decisions. A daughter's marriage could shift alliances, tethering distant rulers to the Khan's legacy. Though their voices were muted, their wombs shaped the very map of empire. The silken chambers of the harem became as decisive as any battlefield, weaving together bloodlines that determined the fate of nations. Yet this influence was double-edged. To fail in bearing children was to risk erasure. Women without heirs faded into obscurity, their lives reduced to whispers within the palace walls. Those who succeeded gained temporary recognition, but always through the lens of their children, not for themselves. their individual desires, fears, or sorrows dissolved into the collective story of empire. The irony is stark. Women who lived in silence nonetheless held the keys to the Khan's greatest legacy, his descendants. Without them, his name would not echo through centuries, nor would millions today trace their ancestry back to him. They were invisible pillars, holding aloft a dynasty that history attributed to one man alone. The empire of Genghis Khan eventually fractured, as all empires do. His sons and grandsons quarreled, their ambitions splintering the vast territories he had conquered. Yet one element endured far longer than borders or banners: his bloodline. Generations carried his name within their veins, a living testament to his conquests. But woven into that legacy is another story, one that history rarely dares to tell. Every child born to the Khan was both a triumph and a tragedy. Triumph for the empire, which grew stronger with each new heir. Tragedy for the women, whose lives were subsumed into the machinery of dynasty. Their bodies bore the weight of succession, their silence sustaining the illusion of glory. They lived not as individuals but as conduits, their humanity eclipsed by the grandeur of empire. Today, geneticists trace his lineage across continents, estimating that 1 in every 200 men may descend from him. The statistic is staggering, often cited with fascination or even admiration. But behind each number lies a question rarely asked. What did it mean for the women who made this possible? Their faces are absent, their voices erased, their stories untold. The silence they left behind is as vast as the empire itself. In the chronicles of conquest, victory is measured in cities taken, armies defeated, borders redrawn. Yet conquest also writes itself in quieter ways, through the lives consumed in service of empire, through the women whose endurance became the invisible foundation of power. Their suffering was not recorded in ink but in absence, a haunting emptiness that lingers across centuries. Perhaps this is the truest legacy of Genghis Khan. Not only an empire carved from steel and blood, but a silence that still echoes, reminding us that power is never built by one man alone. It is carried on the backs of the unseen, sustained by the sacrifices of those history chose to forget. The candlelight fades, and with it the shadows of an empire built on conquest, silence, and control. From the outside, Genghis Khan's legacy is measured in battles won, lands conquered, and bloodlines spread across continents. But within the walls of his harem, another story unfolded, one of submission, identity lost, and rebellion silenced. You began this journey standing in that candlelit chamber, hearing the soft rustle of silk and the muffled sobs behind closed doors. Now, centuries later, the same silence lingers. It is the silence of women whose names were erased, whose bodies were reduced to vessels of empire, whose voices were never meant to be heard. History remembers the conqueror, but true history also belongs to the conquered, to those who endured in silence, who bore the weight of empire without reward, who remind us that power is never one man's story. So the question remains, when we speak of Genghis Khan's greatness, whose pain are we forgetting? If this story moved you, I invite you to reflect with me. What other secrets lie hidden in history's shadows? Truths whispered but never written. Share your thoughts below. And if you'd like to journey deeper into the forgotten lives behind empires, subscribe and stay with us. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories are not of the men who ruled the world, but of the women who bore its weight in silence.